Good afternoon. And it's a pleasure to have a home game, so to speak, to be able to talk at a laureate university. Well, I heard Herbert talk about movement, and that's what I'm going to do here today, is I move around. I'm fidgety, so I'm going to talk that way. But when I was asked here to come to this conference and talk about the post-methodological era, I gave it a lot of thought, and I was thinking, what aspect should I touch on? And I thought to talk about technology, because I think right now, at this moment in time, we're at a kind of a tipping point in regard to technology. And we have some distinct naysayers and then great fans. And I kind of got the feeling, especially now when I'm looking at technology on a global level, that there's just a lot of misconceptions, a lot of ideas and passions and emotions, to use another term from Herbert, a lot of emotions around technology that could do with a little bit of an analysis, a little bit of a let's stop and look and see, really, what is this technology doing for us? What is the impact? So this is what I'm going to talk about today. I'm going to touch on a lot of different areas of technology that I'm seeing, and I hope that that'll just encourage you to think about these things as well, and perhaps in your own context to try and conduct evaluations which might lead to informed decisions. So let me begin. We've been hearing for a long time that times are changing. Okay? We've talked a lot about the impact of technology and how this old model classroom is disappearing. But I'm seeing it a lot of times in the world replaced by this. And honestly, I don't think there's that much difference between what we see here and what we see there. So clearly, while technology can have an impact, I would argue on a global scale that what I'm seeing more and more and more is the same teaching we've always had, just informed by different tools, okay? Now, I know there are pockets of innovation all around the world, but if you look at it on a meta level, if you were to go into secondary schools in many different countries, and I would argue probably here in Turkey as well, that you will tend to find that teachers continue to do what teachers know best, what is in their DNA, okay? And haven't necessarily changed their teaching or their teaching paradigm. So where are we now in this? That's the question that I try to answer here. And the first thing I want to show you is two interesting graphs. The first one is what is called the hype cycle, or the Gartner cycle, which shows the way that technology develops and how it progresses over time. And the bottom one is actually the innovation cycle, okay? So it's interesting to compare the two here and might give us some insights into what we have to do in regard to technology. So first of all, let's look at this hype cycle. So what happens in the hype cycle? Something new comes up on the market. Everybody thinks it's going to solve world hunger and cause world peace. This is the peak of inflated expectations. This could be Duolingo. This could be any of the number of new apps, which we'll look at in a moment. And people play with it for a long time. They get used to it, and then they get bored, and then they forget about it, and you fall into the trough of disillusionment. Now, the question is, has that app, which excited you so much before, has this approach to education suddenly just proven itself invalid? No, probably not. But the argument is here, maybe we expected too much out of it. And maybe we have to readjust our thinking and slowly but surely over time developed a more balanced approach to the technology and the way it integrates into our own beliefs about learning. And then slowly over time, we reach a plateau of productivity. So when you look at this, and then you see here, though, you see a very different cycle, okay? So here, when you get started, this peak of inflated expectations tends to be involved with about 2 to 3% of the teachers that you would have, your early innovators, okay? Those early innovators then try to get this high adoption, but what you find is that you hit a chasm. That chasm generally refers to this trough of disillusionment, okay? So if you're introducing technology in your schools, the problem is, how do you make this jump, right? And how do you get over here and essentially align the early majority to this slope of enlightenment? And I'd argue it's all about teacher training, okay? And it is little about technology itself. In fact, I was just in a presentation about flipped classroom, and this was what was coming out as well. It's how do we train teachers, and students arguably, to be ready and be on this plateau of productivity, even at this early stage. Because then, as you say, later, the people that you tend to have to adopt at this point, these are what I call the kickers and screamers, right? These are the people that are only coming in because you're forcing them to, okay? So clearly here, this is the link up. This is the interesting thing that we see here between the way a technology flows and the way the adoption goes. And this is our challenge, is right in here. Now, I would argue that there is an inverse relationship right now between technology and pedagogy. Okay? I think I'm seeing all around the world a fact that the trendier the technology gets, the weaker the methodology becomes. It's very interesting to look at these different tools that are out there. We have tools, they force grammar translation. We have tools that are working on drill and kill. Okay? But I think when you look around, you will find hard to find a new task-based methodology. You find it very hard to find new approaches to project learning within the technology that we have for language teaching, okay? We have a lot of gamified drill and kill. It's fun, it looks interesting, but ultimately it's not changing anything, okay? Uncertain progression. Another thing that we've noticed is that in the newer technologies that you're seeing, the app-based technologies, that there is no logical progression. There's very little scope and sequence, few syllabi, which you can immediately adapt to and understand. So you wonder, how are the students learning? Now, as you'll see, there's arguments that they say that there's a different approach to this learning, and it's being crowdsourced by looking at how learners learn, by parsing big data, but ultimately, when you look at this from the perspective of us as language teachers, the technology seems to be disconnected to the methodology, and therefore what it leads to is isolated learners and disconnected teachers, okay? So clearly right now we have techies over here and we have teachers over here, and we're not really connecting the way that we should. Let me just take a sip of water here. When we were talking, by the way, listening to Herbert, it was interesting. He talked about some areas like gamification. He talked about challenge and relevance and things like that. And I do think that you're going to see some of those elements in technology as well. But I would argue that what makes that potent, the kind of message that Herbert gave about emotional intelligences, only comes when you bring them all together. I would argue right now what we're seeing is that they're disconnected. So let's talk about traditional publishers and technology. And I know we have publishers out here, but I just want to say is that what we're still seeing today is publishers converting textbooks into digital versions of the same thing, okay? This is beginning to change, but I would argue, take a look right now. When you go online with an online course, you are going to see a page. And that page may be interactive, but it's still a page. There's enhanced interactivity. There's increased multimedia. Yeah? There is some tracking through an LMS. But I would argue that in these cases, that the multimedia is still hiding the traditional model. We haven't broken out of that. We haven't taken that next step forward. The teaching model in our textbooks, digital or otherwise, is still pretty much 20th century, okay? So it's still about the book, digital or otherwise. And I think one of the reasons for this is that there's little evidence of tools for teachers and the ability within an online digital course to create a space for student creation, okay? And maybe the reason for that is that a publishing model is just not set up in order to allow those kind of spaces, and maybe it's going to be the local schools working together with publishers to create this. But right now, you know, what I'm hearing and listening to when I follow a lot of you here in Turkey on the web about your technology that you're doing at your individual institutions, all of these things that you're doing locally, wouldn't it be great if you could find a way that you could be able to take the core digital course and combine your own information, your own activities, together with those curated activities, and have the students produce, for example, portfolios of their work or their audio or their visual, all in one place, all set together and fully integrated, okay? This is a future opportunity. This is something that can happen. But I'm wondering right now, when I look at technology, whether the models that we have in publishing are going to allow this kind of thing to happen. Now, we do have examples. How many of you have ever heard of English 360? Anybody ever used that? English 3, I see a few people. English 360 was something created by a guy named Cleve Miller, and he had a great idea. And his idea was precisely this, was to take content from publishers and then to allow teachers to create the lesson plans around it. It was a rudimentary technology. It still had kinks in it, but it was the kind of idea that they were getting at, is that you take ownership for this, be able to break up the learning and put it back together in ways that are important to you. Right now, we can't break this learning up. You can't move around the activities and leave them out. You can create your own guides to do it, but you don't have that kind of power right now in the model which will allow us to do this. So we're at a point here. The reason I point this out is not to slam publishers, but actually for you to have sympathy for publishers, because it's very, very difficult to make this model work and also become a successful publisher in a financial perspective. Because how do you do that? How do you host all of this wealth of material that you would need? It's something that hasn't been solved yet. I will say this, though, that the publishers with whom I interact are busy trying to solve that problem. And I would argue that in the next generation, within 3 to 5 years of courseware, we may see those kinds of solutions taking place. But I don't think they're there necessarily right now. So there's a dilemma here. And it's interesting. Last week I was in Washington, D.C., and I met with the CEO of Blackboard. Are you familiar with Blackboard? It's like Moodle, a big, huge, learning management system. And we met with them, and I was very, very, hands-off, because, this is a linear, kind of learning management system, and I want to have disaggregated learning and just-in-time and teacher control and everything like that. And they're all about what we call the inverted L, yeah? You have your lessons here and your navigation there, and you go with lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3. And we were talking to him about, what his plans are for 3 to 5 years, because he said, at Blackboard we've recognized that we have to move forward. We have to do this differently. We got to get rid of the L. And he pointed to the fact, he said, but it's very difficult, because he has to design for the student today while thinking about the student in 6 to 7 years. So how do you do both? Yeah? What can we decide? What can we design right now? Yeah? And what will it look like later? And he gave an interesting point. He said that in focus groups that he had a focus group with students about 25 or 26 years old. And he asked those students, how would you like to receive your textbooks, digitally or in print? And the 26-year-olds almost unanimously said in print. And then he asked 22-year-olds the same question. They answer, in print. He asked 16-year-olds, same thing. He went down to 13-year-olds. They still said print. He got to 10-year-olds, and they all said digitally on an iPad. Okay? So those 10-year-olds in 6 years are going to be the people we have to write course books for. Okay? But for our students right now, again, to point, what Herbert said about books and the smell of books, yes, I completely agree, and I think most people still do. My children made the point because they're always like, oh, you and your iPads and da-da-da-da-da. And they're 16 and 18. And they said, how am I going to study for an exam on an iPad when I have to have 3 books open? I can't annotate and follow. I need to flip pages and things like that. So what we're seeing here is the struggle, is if you're a publisher and you need to publish a book that's coming out in 10 years, yeah, you have to kind of guess what those people are going to do who are just in 5th grade right now. And I would argue probably the struggle that we're in is to see how can we bridge that gap? How can we be providing something now, but thinking all the time about what is going on later. And the interesting thing, too, is that we used to talk a lot about digital maturity, yeah, and what do they call it? Digital natives and digital immigrants. And I think this is completely outdated nowadays. Because, in fact, the gaps that you're seeing are not gaps among generations. These gaps emerge in years like 3 years, yeah? It's gotten so small that you can't say that there's just us and them anymore. So this is a huge challenge for all of us right now. Now, I would argue that if you give teachers, innovative teachers like yourselves, appropriate tools, you will be able to create learning experiences for your students that are important, and then the publishers and the others will follow suit. I don't see any other way to do it. The other thing that was interesting was to discuss what are we designing for. Are we designing for students, teachers, or administrators, for example? Okay? Big learning management systems generally tend to design for administrators. Okay? But in the case of the new digital publishing pieces, who are we designing for, students or teachers? And I think that's not always clear. Okay? And it has a huge impact when we're trying to design tools for learning. We need to know who is it working for. And it was interesting that this guy from Blackboard has made a total change in his relationship to his technology. He said, we used to focus here, and then we focused here, but now he's changing that, and he's working on the student experience. So bear this in mind. This, I think, is a real dilemma for people in our field, and I don't think there's a major solution, but it would be very interesting from my perspective to find a way through communities of practice, through people working together with great ideas, to be able to provide the answers for today while we wait for the answers for tomorrow. Now let's talk a little bit about the new technology. And new technology is all about apps, okay? What is the new world 3 to 5 years going to be? It's 2 words. It's cloud and mobile, okay? Cloud and mobile. But the problem is, as I said earlier, the technology here is great, but I wouldn't be so sure about the methodology. Now, how many of you have worked with Duolingo? Raise your hands, yeah? And how many of you think it's fun? It is fun. It's a lot of fun. It's like I say, it's the Angry Birds of language education, you know? Because they've figured out how to do great gamification, okay? So you're eager, you want that to happen, okay? You want to go back, you want to do more. But the language is completely decontextualized. So you get, you have to, basically it's a translation program and a vocabulary building program, ultimately. And what it asks you to do is to build sentences. But the sentences can be things like, the bear stole the cookie from the bat, or, you know, I hate children, or something like this. You know, very strange, unusual circumstances that we're facing here. And I've been talking with these guys because I thought, you know, it's weird, it doesn't make a lot of sense, but there is something there that is different than what everybody else has been doing. And I've been trying to understand it, but yet when I talk to them, they can't tell me either. All I know here is, though, what's interesting here is the application of gamification, and that gamification does have an impact on student motivation and student learning. We do know that. So this is a very good application of gamification techniques. Now, each of these other places, though, if you go to them, all of them, this is Voxy, by the way, yeah? Each has its particular shtick, which it then says is the reason why it's so successful. In Babbel, they say you've got 10 million learners from all around the world that you can speak to, right? Now, the interesting question is, how many of the 10 million learners are actually online at any given time? And then you find out it's actually a fraction of 10 million learners. But nevertheless, they're focusing on real-world communication, real time, with other students, like an older thing called Live Mocha used to do as well. So it's about interaction. And now Live Mocha, by the way, is owned by Rosetta Stone. English Central focuses on videos, and that video and real-time content. Again, another thing that Herbert was talking about in his talk, there's your real content. And what they do is they sift through the internet and have engines which look at content from language level perspectives and content area perspectives. And then you have a place like Voxy here, which is one of the newer technologies that's out there. And what Voxy does is similar to English Central. What it does is it claims to be able to personalize your learning. So what it does is it gives you a questionnaire early on, and it asks you questions about what your interests are, and you do a very basic test of your English proficiency level. And then it serves you up lessons that are ostensibly directly oriented to your interests, okay? And this is their personalization model. But as we'll see in a moment, I'm not so sure that personalization, and feeding content to somebody are necessarily the same thing, okay? So the point here, and I wanted to put this all up here, is that every one of these is talking about methods, okay? And I thought, as Dietem pointed out early on, that we're in the post-methodological era. So why are all the fancy tech companies giving us methods? Clearly, there's a disconnect there as well, okay? And by the way, the method here is interesting, what they do. Their crowdsourcing method, they take and they have this A and B methodology. So basically, they serve up learning, and they have a question that you have to answer. And they basically say, we tried to pose the question this way, and they look at how all the learners learn, and then they say, okay, A wins, we'll use that, we take B out. And it's this constant crowdsourcing A and B technology, which is driving the way the learning trees go. But again, without a real syllabus, and no way, ultimately, for you to understand and contextualize your learning. So, to summarize a little bit about the new tech, okay, there's few tools here in the new technology, okay? As you'll notice in all the things that I just described to you, it's the computer student interaction the content being driven to the student, whether it's parsed and served to you because it's closer to what you need. Nevertheless, you don't see a very, very much production in these systems at all, okay? It's mostly reactive. The systems are fairly locked. So you go into any of these new apps, you will find that you can do lots of different things, but you can't change that learning. And especially if you're a teacher, there's very little you can do as a teacher to modify that content or to put it together in a different way. Interestingly, you'll see if you go online that this Duolingo is actually now creating a little mini learning management system and trying to sell their program into schools around the world, especially in Brazil, interestingly, so that teachers can begin to use it in ways that would fit into their classroom. But when I spoke to them and I asked them, well, that's great, I'm really encouraged about that, but can we take the modules and move them around a little bit so that we can make them align with our curriculum? And there they said no. So it's still locked, okay? Good gamification, good content, or good analytics, but never all three. That's the problem, okay? Wouldn't it be great if we could get all of these put together in one? That's what I personally am trying to find a way to do, because I think if we can figure that out, then technology will be an enormous benefit to our classrooms. okay? But right now what we're saying is that the technology does not necessarily push change, okay? In fact, if you do it wrong, it can slow down your innovation. And it can take the eye off the ball, especially decision makers who get blinded by the bells and whistles of the technology and don't have the time to dig deeper into what the learning process is all about and what impact this is having on it. And I like this cartoon here. For those that can't read it, it just says, now this is just a simulation of what the blocks will look like once they're assembled. Yeah? And that shows, why do you need to do that when you can do that, ultimately? How can you make them go together would be the real question. So, this is a very interesting topic, big data and adaptive learning. A colleague of mine, who many of you probably know, and I think he's spoken here in Turkey a number of times, Gavin Dudene from the Consultants E. We work quite closely with him on developing learning tools for our network of universities. But he had a talk recently, he called it of big data and little data, and he kind of set up the situation of an us versus them situation, where big data is what I talk about now, these new huge analytic engines, and little data, which is essentially the local teacher using informed technology in the individual classroom. And he says that they're diametrically opposed. I think right now they are, but they don't have to be. But let's look at a little bit of this big data, okay? We have information in abundance, okay? As you can see, a publisher with which the publisher's name begins with P, yeah, has been buying lots and lots of engines around the world, okay? And these big, robust engines are trying to interpret data on students, how their performance is doing, and use that data to inform the learning practice. Unfortunately, what I would posit here is simply this. Information does not equal knowledge. Information becomes knowledge, in my opinion, when it's sent through the filter of an idea or a belief. And I think that these big engines that we're pushing out here are not being parsed through that pedagogy. So once again, we have this same problem, is that we're taking lots of interesting technology, in this case, lots of data, but not really taking the time to think about what that data means and using it to a proper purpose. Adaptive engines are one way in which people are trying to harness this wealth of information, and then to give you, via the adaptive engines, student content which is relevant to their particular needs. And we see that it's pretty good on grammar. So if you want students to go in and do grammar exercises, rather than having every student do the same activity and the same questions, the adaptive engine will allow you to feed student X the questions that are more focused on what he did in the assessment, and student Y the questions that they require. This works really well with grammar. It gets murkier when you're teaching skills, reading, writing, listening, speaking, and becomes even more tricky when you're trying to do things around tasks. So adaptive engines have their place, but they need to be anchored again in a pedagogy, in a philosophy of education that helps them support what the learning is in the classroom. Interestingly here, there are some efforts going on right now that I find very interesting, and that is trying to get adaptive engines to work with core competencies. So to take, for example, the can-do statements on the Sefer as an example, to say, okay, how can we get an adaptive engine to analyze student learning based on productive tasks that are tied to those can-do statements? There is a way to do this. It hasn't happened yet, but at that point, I think, then suddenly you're getting some very, very useful information that goes beyond the basic information that you would get on grammar that's coming out of the adaptive engines. Now, adaptive does not equal personalization, okay? That's the other thing that I think is important and is a misconception that we're hearing all around in the new technology world. Oh, we have these engines that's going to give you exactly what you want to read about. Oh, we have these engines that are going to give you the content here. But where are you in this equation? Where is the decision making that is going on? You have no decision making in this. You're handing over your learning to the engine, okay? And assuming, well, this computer knows best, okay? And they're going to take care of that. That, for me, is a problem with this technology, okay? We have to have a way that teachers and students can in some way have a back and forth relationship with this data. There's not enough of that. There's too much reliance on the system itself to interpret all the data. I find it far more powerful in my mind is when, and I said here, when it works best with a human adaptive engine. I said I love it when a learning management system or something similar can give me tons of data about my students. And it's totally cool to have a dashboard where I, as a teacher, and I'm busy, can go and look and see, okay, here's my class. You know, I have, for instance, green, yellow, red based on, you know, student performance. You know, I'm busy. I got to see what's going on. And then I can dig down further. But it's me who's doing the digging here, okay, and not just the adaptive engine. And I have that ability to intervene and correct, okay? Somehow, in the adaptive, we're taking the teacher a bit out of the equation. And I think that is dangerous. It doesn't have to be that way, but I think it's a trend which we have to look out for, okay? So I like to say it works best with a human adaptive engine because I think you are, as teachers, the best adaptive engines that there are. So we need little data. That, as Gavin, using Gavin's term, little data, the data you collect locally in your classrooms to help parse the big data. And that requires action research, okay? That requires localization as well, because of course these big engines are still not ready to be able to change and focus on local conditions. And when I listened to the talk just before this, that came up, you know, well, how do we localize, in that case, flipped classroom models? And that's very true. And how do we localize these big data pools? And empathy also, I think, is, you know, we never consider that, you know. We don't have adaptive empathy engines, okay? So it's not just what, but how, okay? When the information is delivered to your students, there may be many different ways in which they want to see it, not just the leveling of the content itself. So there is great opportunity here, but at this point in time, again, it's disconnected, and it needs to be brought closer together. Now, this is a school in San Francisco, okay? Alt school. This school was founded, hang on, just before we start, this school was founded by a man who used to be the head of personalization at Google, okay? He's left Google, he's done all kinds of tech startups, and he decided he wanted to go and take what he learned in the venture capital technology world and translate it to primary education. And I think it's a very interesting and exciting model, which just received like $50 million funding from Mark Zuckerberg at Facebook right now, to explore a new and different model in the way technology works with education. So here's just a brief example of some of their technologists talking about what alt school does. And I think this is something to look out for because this could be the model of the future that's very effective. Okay.
Alt School is a collaborative network of microschools that equips outstanding educators with innovative tools. We offer a personalized whole child learning experience that prepares children for the world in 2030. Listening and learning is at the core of our organization. We listen and learn in 3 ways. We structure our organization around listening and learning from our students, teachers, and parents. So we develop new technology to create feedback loops that help us iterate on the learning cycle more quickly. And we also incorporate feedback from teachers, students, and parents at all stages of product development, including concept, design, and during implementation. So as part of our operations organization, we actually have 3 functions that are very solely focused on understanding the satisfaction of our end users, and those end users being our parents, our teachers, and our students. we regularly poll for satisfaction and watch for satisfaction measures to inform what we're going to build next. And we feel that coming from the question of satisfaction as a key metric, we're actually able to uncover user needs and potential solutions much more quickly. One of the key ways that we incorporate listening and learning into our system is by utilizing technology that provides feedback loops for our end users to give their reaction to sort of what they're seeing and what they're able to do and what they're not able to do with the technology that's in their hands. One example we have in the classroom is a student playlist, which is a tool that the students use to actually receive their curriculum and activities week in, week out from the teachers. What we have built into that product is, after every activity is completed, the opportunity for a student to reflect on that activity. That feedback is directly incorporated by the teachers into planning next week's set of activities and curriculum.
What they did in this, what happens in this model is, right now what you see is a strange situation, is you have technology people sitting in labs, creating apps and all kinds of interesting things, and then reading some kind of article about education and how that can work, and then coming out of the labs and throwing it in. What they've done at Alt School is that the technologists actually sit in the classroom with the students and the teachers as they develop. So as you can see here, what they've been doing is working together to develop the technology that solves problems for the teachers.
All of us here, from our engineers to our product managers to our UX researchers to our designers, are focused solely on incorporating live user feedback that we have from our products being used every day. So one great example we had was one of our lead engineers, Alex, was in the classroom every Friday just watching students use the playlist. And then he'd record his observations, talk to the teachers that were in the classroom about what they were observing during the week, and actually was able to formulate a really actionable list of things that we could improve. Then what we were able to do is actually draw up prototypes and mock-ups, share them with the teachers, get their feedback on paper prototypes. And when we were actually able to get the first alpha ready, we were able to actually roll it out to one of the classrooms.
I have technology tools that allow for me to incorporate all of our users. I'm listening to parents, I'm listening to students, I'm listening to teachers, and I'm able to take all of that, synthesize it, and then I have a product team that I can share that synthesis with, that information, and they're very quickly then taking that feedback and iterating on the tools that we have.
One of the greatest things about Alt School is that they are so receptive to feedback. And so I've been working with the product design team on developing class views for the software, because that's just a need that has arisen recently through using the software with children.
So at the end of the day, that's what it's all about. Working closely to listen and learn from our students, teachers, and parents to incorporate their needs and understanding of what's to come, to fully develop this dream of building a 21st century education model.
What you're seeing here is a true collaboration, okay? This is the point. It's a true collaboration which allows teachers also, I'm just going to skip to the next, I'll just go to the next slide. Is it not going to let me out? Cut that one off. Okay. Whoops. Here we go. Now we're back again. All right. Give me a second. Sorry about that. There we go. What it does is it allows the teachers to make decisions around the technology. So they've been listening to the students, and then what they do is they create the playlist, which is fascinating. So what the playlist, as you can see, is small chunked learning that the teacher can drive up, and based on the learning that they're seeing through the analytic engine, make the decisions for the students. So as you can see, there are a number of different subjects here. But like here, upload a picture of your imaginary house inspired by XYZ, focusing on a snack budget, okay? All kinds of interesting task-based things that are being done in very small chunks. And every day when a student comes to this school, they get their playlist, and they get it on an iPad, and they come in and they look, and they work through it. And they can check I'm finished or I'm not finished. But the point here is they're making decisions about their learning, okay? They're choosing, I'm going to go here, I'm going to go there, you know, how they want to put it together. The teachers, at the same time, are being able to go and look at the analytics that are being given and then to take those analytics and apply it to the individual students on a local level, okay? So here you have strong analytics to guide learning, but student and teacher decision-making in the process. So take a look at that at some point, Alt School. Okay, you'll find them on the web. They're very exciting, and that video you'll find very quickly as well. So then I wanted to just change here a little bit and focus on a little bit on evidence, okay? So what evidence do we have about technology's impact? And I'll tell you what, there's not a lot, okay? Most of the things that we have, as I pointed out here, are quite anecdotal. Okay, we have small analyses of short, localized examples of best practice, okay? The couple of the really big impact studies we hear, BECTA had 2 impact studies. The US Department of Education came out with a big study, Impact of Online Education, in 2010. And the OECD had one in 2007. These are the only real long-term studies that you will see that you can find. There are some additional ones from US states and in other countries, but they're few and far between, okay? Interestingly, most of the data we have on education and technology focuses on early adopters. And you remember that chart that I showed you. We're not focusing on what happens later. So on that scale of going up to maturity, we don't know. So we know there's an innovative teacher, say here in Turkey, and there's hundreds of them, as I know, and they try out a new technology and they run it for a year, and then they issue the report, okay? But we don't know what's happening in year 3, 4, and 5, okay? So what happens when the technology becomes more mature? Is it being adopted the way you expected? Is it changing? And most important, you know, what is the impact on student learning? Because ultimately, that's what decision makers ask. If you go to a minister of education or somebody from a large group like ours, they're going to tell me, when I talk about technology adoption, they're going to say, well, what information can you give me about student outcomes and the impact on this technology has had specifically, and prove it? And I think that's difficult to do. And there hasn't been enough study going in there to really give us a lot of information. We can make certain trends and assumptions, but we really don't have enough data to be sure. So what we can say is that in aggregate, the studies point to modest improvements in learning outcomes, okay? Modest improvements in learning outcomes. Interestingly, too, for those of you interested in flipped classroom, blended learning has shown itself, of all these outcomes, to be the one that seems to demonstrate the highest level of impact on student success, okay? However, interesting here, in a big study by 2 German researchers, they're actually economists, not education people, Fuchs and Wössmann, they said this complicated thing. While the bivariate correlation between the availability of computers at school and student performance is strongly and statistically significantly positive, the correlation becomes small and statistically indistinguishable from 0 once other school characteristics are held constant. Digest that one for a second, okay, while I take a sip of water. So what does that mean for us? It means this, really. Here are the elements of a successful language program, I would argue, or for any educational institution, right? You need strong leadership that will advocate and help you achieve your goals. You need a vision, obviously, yeah? And underneath that vision, you need goals that are identifiable and that can be communicated to people. Yeah, you need a technology plan, definitely, okay? Yeah, eventually, all of our institutions are going to have a technology plan and not just simply random best practice if you want to scale up your technology. You need funding. You need money for technology. You need resources, and I just don't mean funding. You need human resources as well. You need lots of professional development, as we said. and you need a community within which to operate. There are elements of a successful program, and only one component is specifically related to technology. Okay? So, well, actually, I'll come to that in a second. So what does that mean? That means what we've been seeing is that essentially language programs that are teaching effectively use technology well, okay? And that it's not the technology that is making the impact as much as it is the quality of the points that you see here, okay, that leads them to take advantage of an opportunity and make it happen. So I think that's a key outcome here. The argument being that these programs would be effective whether they had the technology or not. And that is what the research seems to show right now. And that has obviously ramifications for us in the way that we approach technology. If we have a clear set of principles behind our program, yeah, and we pay a lot of attention to professional development, we provide our teachers with resources, and some of them may be technological, then we will integrate technology successfully, and it will become a tool in our favor. But if we don't have all of these, technology is not going to solve the problem for us. And that is the danger, I think, that we find, is that people think that technology is going to function successfully without all of these. Now, of course, you need standards, okay, in which to build technology. And one of the problems has always been that technology is a moving target. And if we focus too much on the individual technology tools, then we're going to be constantly trying to catch up to what's going to happen next, and the next thing, and the next thing. And that's frustrating for teachers. It sure is frustrating for me. I never feel that I'm caught up, you know? But ISTE, these are the ISTE standards, and I think they're really useful. The ISTE standards are not dependent on the technologies themselves, okay? So we look at our ability to use technology and follow, again, looks pretty similar to what Herbert was talking about when you get right down to it. Creativity and innovation, what they call the make it, yeah? So you need technology. How do you use technology to facilitate student production, creation, etc.? Communicate and collaborate. How do you share it? How do you use those tools, be they chats, be they video conferences, forums, wikis, blogs, etc., to allow communication between students, between teachers and students, etc. Research and information, yeah. How do we use those digital tools for gathering information, student exploration? Critical thinking, again. Digital citizenship and operations and concepts, which is the one here, which is really aimed at the tools themselves, but not limited to particular tools. But that as you introduce tools, you have to make sure that all of the students and the teachers are comfortable with them. So these ISTE core standards, yeah, can prove the solid basis for your technology adoption. And if you apply them, then you are always able to adapt to the next phase of technology that is brought in. And I think that what I'm seeing now in technology is that we're focusing too much on the tools and not enough on this. And frankly, where the energy is really happening in this, and I encourage you to go there, is not in ELT, because I think our industry is way behind the mark compared to, for instance, the K through 12 education sphere, where they're doing much more innovative stuff right now. And I encourage you to look at K-12 education around the world, because that's where it's really happening at this point. And there's things that we can easily adapt to our ELT world. So, then I just wanted to show this, because this is, I think, is the professional development reflection of the ISTE standards. So clearly, let me just check our time here. Are we doing? Good. So clearly, you need, if you want to be successful in the teaching when you're doing your technology training, you need to have more than just this knowledge here, obviously. You need to know about English. You need to know about English language as well, obviously, because you can't teach something you don't know anything about, although I have had teachers who do. Yeah. I can remember them at university. And then you have to have the pedagogical knowledge, obviously. You know, your skill as a teacher. And it's that sweet spot that we have to achieve. So that ultimately, I think, is the training perspective, and we have to put that into perspective. We have to work on that as we move forward. So let me get into some basic conclusions here of what I was trying to say in a certain rambling way. I apologize, but nevertheless, we are in permanent transition. That is for sure. Okay, so change has changed, I always like to say, and we just simply have to accept that. And technology will not lead to pedagogical change for us unless it's part of a broader commitment to a changed paradigm, okay? Which does not happen overnight. It's a continuum, okay? But you have to change that paradigm to make that technology work, or it's not going to make innovation happen. Technology has the highest impact in places where effective teaching already takes place. Okay? I think that's probably, if I was to leave this talk, that would probably be, for me, the biggest message of all. Okay? And blended learning models are proving to be the most effective. And finally, what do we have? Developers need to partner with practitioners. We have to get away from this split. Okay? Right now, we're way different than each other. We need to get into the classrooms, observe the teacher-student relationship, and develop tools that solve a problem or improve conditions. So technologists have to stop worrying about methods and start listening to teachers, and then develop solutions for teachers and students rather than trying to figure out the next best way to learn a language, as if we don't know anything about language acquisition. We need to develop a body of best practice that is tied to standards, and that these standards cannot be related to a specific set of tools, okay? And then over time, finally, we need to continue to collect the data to convince the decision makers that the technology is having an impact. So we're at that tipping point right now, and these are the challenges that we have. There's rich potential in the future, but right now, it can go either way. So, thank you.